So, welcome to the second episode of The Only Woman in the Room. This is Aisha Sarwari.
And I'm Lashley Pulsipher.
Lashley, today we're going to talk about things that women would do, things we would do that we wouldn't do if we were men. So, my first question to you would be, what are your experiences about casual sexism, everyday sexism?
I had a job right during grad school, and I worked for a man in a research capacity, and he would call me babe. He'd come into my office and say, "Hey Lash, hey babe, can you come to my office? Can you take some notes for me?" And it just drove me crazy. And I think he was trying to be cool and hip, but I mean, seriously, it was a workplace, and I didn't understand why he would call me babe. I mean, I wouldn't go around to my male colleagues and go, "Hey hun, can you come in and take notes for me?" So this was, I think, an example that really stands out to me. It's just something that seems so harmless and so innocuous, but it is condescending in a lot of ways.
And I feel like sometimes they hide behind the fact that it's innocuous, that it's just so casual that if you take up a fight, you come across as really extreme and really vicious and really bitchy. So
Right.
they put that pressure on you to really come out with your claws. And you really have to think hard about whether you want to do that in a workplace. It's so much easier to let it go, and they thrive on that passivity.
Yeah, you're right. That's always a tough one. Have you had that situation before?
I think with casual sexism in workplaces like in Pakistan, it's a little more hidden. So they would do it in private rather than in a group situation. But here it's nahi yaar, no bud. Which is again also a sort of infantization or a friendly boundary that you don't want anybody to cross, right? And you want people to refer you and to see you as a professional and a thorough professional, and you don't want the constant fading of boundaries of friends and workplaces, unless of course this person is a real bud. In that case, you will call him that yourself, and probably not in a workplace though. So it's slightly more hidden here.
That's right. So that's the easy stuff. That's kind of the everyday stuff. It does wear on us. But what are some extreme situations? Can you think of something that's happened where there's no way this would happen to a man at work that happened to you?
In my early career, and I'm talking about when I was an intern, this was in the US actually. And lastly, what's interesting with sexism is that, there's race and there's religion, religious discrimination that kind of goes hand in hand. I was an intern in the US, and my job was to write the AM news, or to draft an AM piece. And my writing wasn't at par at that time, so my boss, who was at the time from a different religion and hated my guts for being a Muslim intern in a city like San Francisco, would tear it into these little pieces and throw it at my face during a review, and even call me names. So I went through this real serious level of harassment, which was taken to be as, oh, he's such a tough taskmaster. But now that I think about it, when I'm more mature, that was, straight on discrimination, gender discrimination. It was racially motivated, because then I would be asked things like, if something bad would happen back in Pakistan, against his religious community. For example, when any rogue elements targeted his religion, he would then come and question me about it. And he's like, "Oh, now what do you guys want from us?" So he made it a them and us conflict. And it was so many things that I couldn't figure out what part of it was me and what part of it was my people and what part of it should I take on. So I took on all of it, and I absorbed all of that humiliation. And it was, he wanted me to think that it was my work. And I think that's where it gets really interesting, where they punish you because they have this one thing to punish you with, your competence, So that was an extreme example, but varied experiences of the same thing have happened throughout my career.
And probably because you were an easier target in their perception because you're a man. You're not going to get violent, you're not going to have the same aggressive reaction in their assumption, so that they could just easily take it out on you.
Correct. And no intern in that group, and they were from different, varied, diverse cultures, was as targeted as I was. And his colleagues were very embarrassed for me, but nobody stepped in at that time. And this was a very high-level formal organization. We're not talking about a small hole-in-the-wall organization. We're talking about a global organization that prides itself in creating, quality journalism. So that's what happened. And yes, you're right. I think because I was at really low pecking order, it was so easy to be dismissed. So what is your most extreme work experience that would happen to only you because you were a woman and would never happen to a man?
I was working at a kind of a transition job, and the company was a startup communications company and wasn't very good about paying people on time. And I had really reached my limit with this really creepy boss that I had. He'd have me drive so that he could rub my neck, and he was gross. But the last straw was I really needed to get paid, and he was holding my paycheck for ransom, essentially, and asked me to meet him at this apartment to come get my money. And I was at a point where I really needed that paycheck, and I couldn't just let it go. So I went into an apartment alone with this boss of mine, and it was in retrospect a really dangerous situation because anything could have happened in that room, and fortunately it didn't. But he was drinking, and he was saying really disgusting things, and I needed my paycheck and asked him for it politely one last time, and he said, well, if you want to get paid, you have to reach in my pocket and take the money yourself. Fortunately, it was a side pocket. It was fairly loose, so it wasn't as gross as it could have been, but I have never felt more disgusting in a work situation in my life. And I remember walking outside after I got my money and just feeling just completely taken advantage of and very disappointed in the situation, but also really grateful because I knew in that city that there were a lot of other women who were probably in far worse situations than me, just trying to make it and to survive. And I had other options, but a lot of women don't, and that's pretty sad.
When you were telling me the story first, Lashley, I actually thought you were speaking metaphorically, reaching out in his pocket and getting your money. And it's so disgusting on so many levels that he physically violated your personal space by inviting you to do this, knowing very well that the power dynamics were such that you would need to do that. And I think that so many of harassment cases, especially the extreme ones that we're mentioning, are based on the power equation and the need that women have to actually get their paycheck at the end, and they exploit it at varying degrees. The more you are in need, the more they will push you to do things that you would never do.
That's right, yeah.
There's this interesting thing that you came up with called the sexual harassment sandwich. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes, so as I've progressed in my career, found that this happens a lot more frequently, where when you are working closely with the top management of a company, generally they're men, and you have that time with them is so limited and it's so valuable that I've found myself, when I've had to sit with my boss, say the CEO of one of the companies I worked with, he would be giving me important information that I needed in order to do my job, very strategic insights, really key facts and figures that I needed for important work that I was doing. And then the conversation would just suddenly slip into something completely inappropriate and sexual, and then it'd suddenly go back to business. And so this is the term I came up with, is that sexual harassment sandwich, because you really feel trapped because their time is so limited when you're working with people at that high level. It's so valuable to you because you need that information to do your job, and they know that, and so they slip in this other stuff because they have your attention. Have you ever had that happen to you?
Certainly, and I think that is just so clever in such a sinister way that they do that. Private organizations are terrible in that sense, but they're not as bad as government organizations. Government organizations are infested with sexual harassment sandwiches. So I was a mid-career professional working in the government, and we were abroad for a conference, a major conference to do with investment. And I was sitting in the lobby getting key information from a department that needed to give me key information for something that I needed the next day. And the head of that important department or vertical, it could be energy, it could be agriculture, it could be other things, was sitting across me and obviously had an interest in me. And I was sitting there with my notepad and pen trying to get key information from him, and he started hitting on me, but he did it in such a crass way. So I stopped writing my notes and I said, look, I don't appreciate this and I'm not interested in you. But the crudeness with which he responded, saying that you're not a virgin, so what does it matter to you? Just do it. And again, he started talking about work. So I didn't know how to shift gears, whether to be aggressive or not. So I took it down a notch and continued talking about work. And then after that, he said, it's only after you try it that you can determine whether you like it or not. And then I kind of tried to get my claws out. He immediately shifted gears back to the information that I needed.
So you got a triple decker sandwich.
It gave me a lot of indigestion, and it really made me feel horrendous because it's what you term as a mind fuck. You don't know what to do. You don't have the tools. You don't. You're unsure and you doubt yourself about. Did that really happen?
Mm-hmm.
How intense was it?
Mm-hmm.
How offensive was it? Was it sexual harassment? Was it how violently do you need to respond to something like that? And what are your choices? Taking somebody down at that level of government is a serious issue, and a mid-level professional doesn't have the credibility to do it. And so much of this is a game of credibility about your words versus somebody else's. And in the way the structure is designed to make you small and to make you insignificant.
Yeah, right.
What's some other things in the sexual harassment context that you've experienced that just combines all of these things that are casual sexism, things that have a sexual harassment sandwich in them? What's like, and how frequently have you had it throughout your career?
I think it's been since day one, every job I've had. But another thing, it's that access to information being power, and being your ability to get the good projects, to move on to better things in your job. I remember working in that research job, and all the best things happened at night over cigars and whiskey, and they happened at 2 a.m. And so again, that puts women in such an awkward situation, because if you're out with your colleagues at 2 a.m. and there's whiskey and cigars involved, you could easily lose credibility if you do speak up against some inappropriate behavior. But that's where the best research projects were being handed out. And so it's such a difficult position to be in, because you don't want to miss out on opportunities to advance your career if you're ambitious, but at what cost to your personal reputation, to your personal safety, to all kinds of things. So that, I think that's one of the things that I found was very common.
What advice can we give to women who experience this? One thing that I would tell them is to kind of just keep analyzing and reanalyzing how much of a fight they can take up, right? So there have been times where I've really been gone all out, in a war, and taken people down or reported them or told them off and cut my ties with them when I could afford it. But then there have been times when I haven't. And so how do you develop that intelligence of when to fight and when not to?
That's always a difficult one. But one of the things that I think works the best, because it's more of a neutral response, and it comes from an article I read years ago in the New York Times about training animals. When you don't like a behavior and you don't respond to it, usually the animal or the man in question won't repeat the behavior, because sometimes they're just looking for that reaction. And I think a lot of times with the sexual harassment, it can be an immature action to just get a rise out of you, just to see how far they can push things and see if they can push you enough to react. So when you're trying to prep for those situations and you know that something might come up, it's just being able to practice that cold-blooded, that sang-froid of just completely blank stare back, no response, and move on to another subject. And that's really hard to do, but that's probably where to start. And then when things get way out of hand, just knowing when it's appropriate to walk away.
Thank you, Lashley, and thank you, listeners, for this episode. This brings us to the end of the episode. From Aisha Sarwari and
Lashley Pulsipher.
we're signing off. Bye-bye.